When we talk about narcissists, the first thing to understand is that their sense of control is often the very core of their existence. It is not just about having authority over others or manipulating situations in their favor, though those are certainly part of it. But more fundamentally, it is about maintaining the illusion of invulnerability. This illusion is a psychological fortress, a carefully constructed reality where they appear untouchable, admired, and always in command. But what happens when that illusion begins to crumble? That is the point where the silent psychological collapse begins. For a narcissist, control is not merely external, it is deeply internal. Their identity is interwoven with the belief that they are always right, always powerful, and always in a position of influence. Relationships, achievements, even casual interactions are filtered through this lens. Every compliment, every acknowledgement, every bit of recognition feeds the narrative they tell themselves about who they are. The moment someone refuses to play their part, someone sees through the mask, or chooses to disengage, the very foundation of their internal world begins to quiver. Disorientation, the very foundation of their internal world, begins to quiver. Control they once assumed they had over the perceptions and emotions of others starts to feel less like mastery and more like fragility. What makes this moment particularly devastating is that narcissists rarely experience self-doubt in an ordinary sense. Their psyche is constructed to deflect vulnerability and maintain a sense of superiority. However, when the illusion of control falters, the cracks are not always obvious outwardly. Unlike dramatic emotional breakdowns, the collapse is silent, insidious, and deeply internal. They begin to question, did I miscalculate? Was my influence overstated? Did someone see me as I truly am? Flawed, ordinary, and human. These are questions they are not equipped to answer with acceptance, because their self-concept depends on denial and deflection. This loss of perceived control triggers a cascade of internal responses. Anxiety surges where confidence once reigned. Thoughts loop incessantly, searching for explanations, for ways to reassert dominance, for justifications that preserve the grand narrative. Every interaction that once reinforced their sense of authority now becomes a source of tension and doubt. The narcissist may attempt subtle manipulations or aggressive reassertions of power, but internally, they are navigating a psychological landscape that feels increasingly unstable. It is the difference between standing on solid ground and realizing slowly that the ground is made of shifting sand. Interestingly, this collapse is often invisible to outsiders. Narcissists have learned to perform, to present a composed and confident exterior even when the interior is unraveling. They may continue to assert authority, issue demands, or provoke reactions from others, but these actions are often compensatory, desperate attempts to patch a reality that no longer aligns with their self-perception. True collapse is not in what they show, but in what they experience internally. Confusion, fear, shame, and a gnawing sense of vulnerability that they cannot admit. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. It is the beginning of a silent unmasking, the start of a psychological implosion that will affect every thought, emotion, and decision moving forward. When a narcissist senses that their illusion of control is slipping, they are no longer just facing the loss of power over others. They are facing a confrontation with the fragile, unstable foundation of their identity itself. And while the outside world may see only anger, frustration, or manipulation, inside, a quiet, relentless collapse is underway. Understanding this is crucial because it allows us to see beyond the performative confidence of narcissists. It reminds us that their outward domination is built on a precarious internal scaffolding, one that can quietly disintegrate when they lose the sense of control they so desperately depend upon. The moment the illusion shatters, the silent psychological collapse begins, and nothing will ever feel quite the same again. The takeaway is this: power built on illusion is always fragile. When the narcissist's fortress of control crumbles, it is not the world that has defeated them. It is their own mind, confronting the reality that they were never truly untouchable. This moment marks the start of a profound, invisible unraveling, one that quietly reshapes the landscape of their inner world. Once the narcissist's sense of control begins to crack, The next stage of their silent psychological collapse emerges through what we can call emotional disorientation. Typical emotional responses. This is not mere anger, sadness, or frustration. It is a profound internal confusion, a destabilization of the very framework through which they understand themselves and the world around them. For most of their lives, narcissists rely on a predictable system. They project confidence, manipulate perception, and receive reinforcement from the reactions of others. This system creates a feedback loop that maintains their self-concept as powerful, competent, and indispensable. But when that loop breaks, when someone refuses to conform, withdraws validation, or sees through their constructed persona, the loop no longer functions and chaos quietly takes its place. This emotional disorientation is subtle, yet devastating. It often begins with small, creeping doubts. Did I misjudge the situation? Was I wrong? Could I have been exposed? For a mind so accustomed to certainty and the illusion of infallibility, even minor doubts are magnified. Every interaction, every memory, every past manipulation is replayed and scrutinized, searching for evidence of failure or exposure. The narcissist begins to feel what they are ill-equipped to recognize: vulnerability, imperfection, and a lack of control. And unlike ordinary individuals, they have few internal resources to process these feelings constructively. Their habitual deflection, denial, and projection cannot fully contain the growing sense of disarray. Internally, this disorientation is a labyrinth. Thoughts spin in repetitive loops, with no clear exit. They oscillate between self-justification and fleeting moments of self-doubt, constantly attempting to reconcile the disparity between their perceived identity and the reality now visible to them. The anxiety is relentless, yet it is rarely voiced openly. To outsiders, they may appear composed or even aggressive, but internally, they are navigating a storm of uncertainty that threatens the foundations of their psychological defenses. Even seemingly minor interactions, a casual remark, an unreciprocated gesture, or the absence of attention, can feel like seismic shifts, destabilizing the fragile structure of their inner world. What makes this stage particularly insidious is that narcissists often can not recognize or name the disorientation. They have been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid introspection. Self-reflection, vulnerability, and acceptance of imperfection are foreign territories. As a result, they may misinterpret the confusion as external attack, betrayal, or incompetence in others, further entrenching their defensive patterns. In this way, emotional disorientation does not merely challenge their internal equilibrium. It also intensifies the very behaviors that have caused relational fractures in the first place. And yet, there is a subtle depth to this process. Emotional disorientation forces the narcissist into a confrontation with the limits of their control. They begin to realize, even if only subconsciously, that their influence over people and circumstances is not absolute. Their illusions of omnipotence are fragile. They encounter the truth they have long avoided, that their sense of self has depended on others' compliance, admiration, and validation. And now, in the absence of these, they are left with a landscape of uncertainty that cannot be ignored. This stage also highlights the paradox of narcissistic existence. The very strategies that once guaranteed their dominance, the mask, the manipulation, the projection, were now powerless to restore internal stability. The more they attempt to control or correct, the more disoriented they become, because the foundation of their power, built on perception and illusion, has shifted. Each failed attempt to regain certainty intensifies the internal chaos, spiraling them deeper into silent psychological collapse. In essence, emotional disorientation is the narcissist's private, unspoken storm. It is the moment when their constructed reality no longer provides comfort, when the mechanisms they relied upon to maintain superiority fail, and when the internal chaos threatens to overwhelm their habitual defenses. It is silent, invisible, and deeply destabilizing, marking a critical step in the unraveling of a psyche built on illusion. Takeaway is clear. The narcissist's inner world, once so rigid and controlled, is profoundly vulnerable. When emotional disorientation takes hold, the illusion of certainty falters, revealing the fragile humanity beneath. Disquiet, internal chaos signals the beginning of a psychological breakdown that no external display can fully conceal, a collapse that is as inevitable as it is silent. To narcissists, emotional disorientation begins to take root. The next stage of their silent psychological collapse often manifests as obsessive rumination. Unlike healthy reflection, which is a process aimed at understanding and growth, this rumination is compulsive, cyclical, and self-reinforcing. It is a relentless internal replay of events, interactions, and imagined scenarios, each loop feeding the next, each reinforcing the sense of vulnerability that they are desperate to deny. In many ways, this is the narcissist's mind turning against itself, an internal interrogation without resolution. Rumination begins subtly, often triggered by a single interaction that contradicts their carefully maintained self-image. A glance that didn't convey admiration, a refusal to comply, or even the absence of expected attention can spark an internal cascade. Their mind immediately begins to reconstruct the narrative. What did I do wrong? Why did they not respond as expected? Did they see through me? These thoughts are not merely fleeting. They take residence in the mind, looping continuously as if the brain is compulsively trying to solve an unsolvable problem. What makes this stage particularly insidious is that the narcissist's cognitive and emotional defenses, which usually maintain the facade of certainty and superiority, now amply the problem. They cannot simply accept uncertainty. They are programmed to find fault, to assign blame, to control perception. Yet, in the absence of compliance or admiration, there is no external validation to regulate these compulsive thoughts. They become trapped in a hall of mirrors, endlessly analyzing, revising, and replaying every interaction for potential mistakes or exposure. Each mental loop deepens their anxiety and compounds the sense of internal collapse. Rumination is also deeply isolating. While they might outwardly interact with others, their mind is largely consumed with internal rehearsal. Relationships, decisions, and even mundane social encounters are filtered through the lens of this obsessive self-surveillance. They may seek reassurance, manipulate conversations, or test boundaries repeatedly, but these behaviors often fail to alleviate the mental pressure. Instead, every failed attempt to restore control reinforces the narrative of inadequacy or betrayal, intensifying their internal torment. Another critical aspect of this obsessive rumination is its connection to the narcissist's sphere of exposure. They have invested their identity in a carefully constructed persona, one that projects confidence, competence, and omnipotence. When someone pierces that illusion, or when admiration and validation are withdrawn, the narcissist experiences the terrifying recognition that their self-concept is dependent on others' perceptions. Rumination becomes a desperate, often unconscious attempt to regain control over that perception. They scrutinize every word, action, and intention, endlessly trying to reconstruct the reality that will protect their fragile ego. Importantly, this stage is not just about self-blame. Rumination also includes intense preoccupation with the perceived betrayal or independence of others. The narcissist becomes consumed by the way, that ifs, and could haves, imagining scenarios where they were not deceived, not rejected, not exposed. Their imagination becomes a battleground, oscillating between fantasies of regained dominance and dread of irreparable loss. This mental state is exhausting and corrosive, gradually eroding their capacity for empathy, insight, or adaptive response. The relentless nature of obsessive rumination ensures that the narcissist is continuously engaged in a form of psychological self-attack. Their mind, once a tool for control and dominance, has turned inward as the arena of torment. There is no external display necessary for this collapse. It is entirely internal, invisible to observers, yet profoundly destabilizing. Every thought, every imagined slight, every mental reconstruction of past interactions contributes to a growing sense of vulnerability and impending collapse. In essence, obsessive rumination is the narcissist's inner trap, a cycle that magnifies their fear, disorients their thinking, and accelerates the psychological unraveling initiated by emotional disorientation. The mind, in its effort to regain control, only tightens the chains of its own anxiety, spiraling deeper into collapse. Conclusion is unmistakable. When a narcissist enters this stage, their internal world becomes a relentless loop of self-scrutiny and imagined betrayal, a psychological echo chamber that erodes stability. The collapse is silent, invisible, yet profoundly consequential, a private torment from which there is no easy escape. As the narcissist's mind becomes ensnared in obsessive rumination, the next subtle but devastating shift often occurs in their emotional regulation. For most people, emotions serve as signals, informing decisions, guiding social interactions, and connecting us to others. For a narcissist, emotions are often instruments of control. They are carefully managed, projected, and manipulated to maintain power and dominance. But when they face a loss of control, when someone they depended on for validation walks away, their emotional architecture begins to fracture. This is not a sudden explosion of anger or grief. It is a slow, creeping erosion of emotional stability, a psychological seepage that is invisible yet deeply destabilizing. Initially, the narcissist attempts to mask this instability. Outwardly, they may maintain composure, perhaps even doubling down on charm, deflection, or manipulation. Internally, however, they are in turmoil. The familiar mechanisms that once allowed them to suppress or control inconvenient feelings, shame, vulnerability, fear, start to fail. These emotions, which had been held at bay through projection and denial, now rise unbidden, unmanageable, and unfamiliar. The sense of internal chaos emerges, where previously there was calculated equilibrium. One of the most insidious aspects of this emotional collapse is the blurring of cause and effect in the narcissist's mind. They may attempt to rationalize their feelings, attributing their distress to external circumstances or to the actions of others, yet the intensity of the emotional experience often outpaces logical explanation. Anxiety, guilt, and self-directed anger intermingle, creating an internal storm that cannot be easily calmed. The narcissist becomes both judge and jury of their own perceived failings, yet lacks the objectivity to reconcile these judgments with reality. This stage also reveals the narcissist's dependence on others for emotional regulation. Unlike healthy individuals who can process feelings internally or seek authentic support, the narcissist relies heavily on external sources to confirm their worth and manage their internal state. When these sources are withdrawn, when a key person rejects, abandons, or disengages the narcissist is left with raw, unfiltered emotions that they are ill-equipped to manage. The loss of emotional scaffolding precipitates a sense of destabilization that is both terrifying and unfamiliar. Interestingly, this emotional disintegration often triggers behaviors that are paradoxical. The narcissist may oscillate between extreme attempts to regain control through manipulation, rage, or frantic attention-seeking, and withdrawal or numbness, as if retreating from a world that no longer validates their constructed self. These swings are not mere mood fluctuations. They are symptomatic of a deeper structural collapse in the capacity to regulate feelings, a collapse that mirrors the earlier stages of cognitive and compulsive disruption. It is here, in the erosion of emotional regulation, that the silent collapse becomes most personally corrosive. The narcissist may not show obvious signs to the outside world, yet internally, their psyche is in constant turbulence. They may replay interactions, anticipate rejection, and experience waves of shame and inadequacy that they cannot contain. The emotional intensity fuels further rumination, which, in turn, deepens the instability. A feedback loop that tightens the grip of the psychological breakdown. What makes this stage particularly critical is that it touches the core of the narcissist's identity. Their carefully maintained self-image, built on competence, control, and invulnerability, is now at odds with an internal reality they cannot suppress. The failure to regulate emotions exposes vulnerability, fragility, and dependency, traits that the narcissist has historically disavowed. The discrepancy between external projection and internal experience intensifies anxiety, guilt, and shame, creating a silent corrosive collapse that threatens the foundation of their ego. Ultimately, the breakdown of emotional regulation is a defining moment in the narcissist's hidden disintegration. It marks the point where the inner machinery of control falters, leaving them exposed to falters, leaving them exposed to feelings they cannot command or contain. The collapse is not spectacular or public. It is private, relentless, and psychologically devastating, signaling the deep vulnerability that underlies even the most confident facade. In this quiet turmoil, the narcissist confronts the painful truth. Without external validation to manage their internal world, they are emotionally unmoored, and the very strategies that once sustained them have become instruments of their silent undoing. Once the narcissist's emotional regulation begins to falter, a more subtle and insidious process often unfolds. The distortion of reality within their own mind. This is not merely lying to others, which they have mastered. This is a private, internal twisting of perception that arises when the familiar scaffolding of external validation is removed. The narcissist has long relied on relationships, attention, and admiration to stabilize their self-concept. When an empath, a partner, or someone who sees them in ways that bypass the facade disengages, the narcissist experiences a rupture, a fracture between the image they project and the world as it is. In this state, reality becomes malleable, not for clever manipulation, but out of sheer necessity. The narcissist begins to reconstruct the narrative of their life to preserve their ego. Memories may be selectively rewritten. Intentions and actions are reframed to cast themselves as the victim, the misunderstood, or the wronged. This internal rewriting is less a conscious strategy than a desperate attempt to prevent the full confrontation with loss, shame, and inadequacy. Without the empath's presence to absorb, mirror, or buffer these emotions, the narcissist's mind starts to contort under the weight of unempath or obsessed grief and guilt. What is particularly fascinating and dangerous is the degree to which distorted reality can spiral. The narcissist may begin to see betrayal and abandonment everywhere, projecting their internal turmoil onto the world around them. Ordinary interactions become loaded with imagined slights. Casual remarks are interpreted as deliberate attacks. Their internal dialogue, which once reinforced confidence and control, now amplifies paranoia and suspicion. The mind that once navigated relationships with precision is now trapped in a feedback loop of misperception, where every observation is filtered through the lens of loss and ego fragility. This distortion also touches moral reasoning. To roast. In the next, the narcissist, who often frames themselves as ethically superior or invulnerable to ordinary human weakness, now faces evidence that their actions have caused real harm. Yet acknowledging this truth is unbearable. It would mean confronting vulnerability, remorse, and the reality of their own destructiveness. Instead, their perception shifts. They reinterpret events to absolve themselves, rationalize their choices, or externalize blame. Even when faced with objective consequences, the narcissist's mind can weave intricate justifications that preserve the illusion of moral integrity. The spiritual and psychological implications of this stage are profound. In losing an empath, someone who often functions as a mirror to their deeper self, the narcissist loses not just validation, but a connection to the truth of their own humanity. Throughout this reflection, they are forced to navigate life through increasingly distorted perceptions, detached from authentic emotional feedback. This disconnection fosters a quiet, relentless erosion of insight. The very self that appeared so confident and coherent begins to unravel internally as the gap between perception and reality widens at the same time. This process is internally isolating. The narcissist cannot admit the depth of their confusion because vulnerability contradicts the identity they have cultivated. They are left alone with their constructions, turning inward to negotiate a reality that no longer feels safe or coherent. The internal monologue becomes a theater of tension, constantly rehearsing, adjusting, and defending a self-concept under siege. And yet, despite the mental gymnastics, there is an undercurrent of recognition, a faint, often unconscious awareness that something essential has been lost, that the empath's departure cannot be undone or ignored. Ultimately, the distortion of reality is both a defense and a form of self-destruction. It protects the narcissist from immediate emotional collapse, yet it erodes clarity insight, and relational competence over time. Their mind becomes a closed circuit of justification, projection, and misperception, unable to reconcile the truth of their loss with the demands of their fragile ego. The cruel irony is that the narcissist's greatest strength, the ability to construct a convincing self-image, becomes the mechanism of their quiet undoing. Tempting to shield themselves from pain, they distort reality so thoroughly that they are left trapped in a shadow version of the world, a private realm of psychological chaos that is invisible to outsiders, but devastating in its intensity. The empath's absence leaves a void that cannot be filled, a truth that cannot be avoided, and a mind that is quietly inexorably unraveling. When an empath leaves, the narcissist experiences a subtle yet profound rupture in their sense of control. For years, their interactions were a carefully choreographed dance. Manipulation, charm, and occasional intimidation all served to maintain dominance and secure the validation they craved. The empath fun, cashioned as both mirror and amplifier, reflecting back the image the narcissist wished to project while silently absorbing the turbulence beneath the surface. When that empath withdraws, the narcissist loses not just a source of admiration, but a structural support of their identity. The mind that once felt invincible suddenly confronts a destabilizing emptiness, a space where the familiar patterns of control no longer hold sway. This loss triggers a cascade of internal reactions that are both psychological and spiritual. On a psychological level, the narcissist often experiences a panic that is hidden from the world, a sense of being unmoored from the very framework that sustained their self-image. Thoughts race, scenarios are reimagined, and every memory of the departed empath is scrutinized for errors, injustices, or opportunities for reinterpretation. This cognitive frenzy is not aimed at genuine understanding. It is an instinctive effort to reclaim power, to rebuild the illusion of control that has been stripped away. The narcissist is left negotiating a paradox. The person they once believed could be easily managed, who seemed pliable to their influence, is now unreachable, and with that inaccessibility comes a quiet, insidious erosion of certainty. Spiritually, the loss penetrates deeper than mere ego bruising. Narcissists often operate as if they are exempt from the consequences of authentic emotional connection, believing that their charm, intellect, or force of will allows them to navigate relationships without vulnerability. The empath's departure challenges that belief. It forces an encounter with the limitations of their power, with the reality that true empathy cannot be forced, coerced, or fabricated. In this moment, there is a silent confrontation with a universal truth. Influence without connection is hollow, and control without reciprocity is ultimately unsatisfying. Even if the narcissist refuses to acknowledge this consciously, it permeates their inner landscape, creating a dissonance between their perception of omnipotence and the undeniable evidence of loss. The narcissist's response to this dissonance is often defensive. To rationalize the empath's departure, attributing it to weakness, misunderstanding, or ingratitude. This rationalization, while seemingly clever, is a fragilization, while seemingly clever is a fragile scaffold. It does not address the underlying shift in internal equilibrium. Without the empath, the narcissist cannot project their self-concept onto another with the same efficiency, cannot manipulate relational energy to reinforce their ego, and cannot rely on external validation to stabilize their sense of worth. The absence becomes a mirror reflecting not just the empath's autonomy, but the narcissist's own incompleteness. Over time, this destabilization can catalyze profound changes, though not necessarily in ways the narcissist intends. The mind, deprived of its accustomed patterns of domination, begins to operate in a state of heightened vulnerability. Anxiety and self-doubt seep in, often unnoticed by the outside world. The narcissist may intensify attempts at control elsewhere, lash out in unexpected ways, or withdraw into obsessive rumination. Internally, however, they are negotiating a silent collapse, a restructuring of identity forced by the recognition that their previous strategies no longer suffice. And yet, within this crisis lies the possibility of insight. While narcissists rarely arrive at self-awareness willingly, the absence of the empath removes the buffer that perpetuated illusion. The vacuum created by their departure presents a rare, though often unrecognized, Opportunity for reflection. The narcissist must confront a reality that has always been there, quietly demanding acknowledgement. That influence without empathy is shallow. That admiration without authenticity is shallow. That admiration without authenticity is empty, and that the bonds of human connection cannot be fully controlled or replaced. Ultimately, the loss of an empath exposes the narcissist to the quiet truth of their own limitations. It is a moment of destabilization that is invisible to most observers, but seismic within the inner world of the narcissist. In this silent upheaval, the absence of one person reveals the hollowness of all that was built on illusion. Their mind, once a fortress of certainty, is forced into confrontation with the fragile scaffolding of ego, a confrontation that is both unsettling and transformative, whether they choose to recognize it or not.